This would be a half-day workshop with all the questions and answers. I remember asking for Tan Lau several years ago, what's a ton of carbon actually worth? And there's no answer to that. There's absolutely zero answer. It could be zero, whatever the clients are willing to pay for. It's probably kind of like free-range chicken. And more than free-range, people pay for it. We got to make a little bit of a change up here on the stage. As we go to the next panel.
Yeah, that's what
That's what
So we're delighted to get him at least out here being acquainted with no-till. And getting more in the vein of what Al Hines has been working with for years and years and years. I'm going to ask him when he started at OSU, but he's obviously retired, still very active. And Bill Richards predates him even more than that. Bill, for those of you who may not know, Bill was chief of SCS and then it transitioned to NRCS under the first President George Bush. And he's been no-till farming since the researchers at Worcester, OARDC, part of Ohio State, started research plots at Worcester in 1962 that are still continuing on no-till. And Bill learned from Van Dorn and Glover Triplett and was into it very soon after they started those plots. So before, he was trying things even before. So he started when he was 8 years old, I think. So he's down in the Scioto River Valley. Well, I put a title on here, but they're going to kind of talk about whatever they want to talk about. It's, global warming and federal policy and commodities and how that all affects it. And we're going to begin with Bill, and then I think Ben is going to go next, and then Al Hines. Bill, here, I'll give you the microphone.
Well, thank you. Is it working all right? Yeah. I can't resist on your story about the wind blowing from state to state. They had me out, I think it was in southwest New Mexico, and that was a place where wind erosion was so bad, they showed me telephone poles that you could just reach out and get the cross piece. Or I saw center pivots that only the very top was sticking out. They had a no-till farmer there that they wanted to take me to see, actually, and it's what his problems were. And he says, well, the biggest problem is my neighbors. Their soil's all blown over, it's killing my cotton. So I've never quite had that yet, but it was happening, and it was a real lesson. Okay, they told me to write things down.
New batteries didn't seem to solve.
How about that? Yeah. It's not working at all, is it? Okay. They had to tell me I better write things down to keep them under control, but then I write it down and can't read it. But anyway, thanks to the No-Till Council for the work you did. But I'm going to brag a little. You notice I'm the only one in proper uniform up here. But we owe so much to Ohio State. I mean, we've sort of nicknamed it the cradle of no-till for the country and really for much of the world. That original research at Worcester was really what got all this started. Those plots are still there. I owe so much to Triplett and Van Dorn. As I joked, I was trying crazy things even before them, and it wasn't working. And I met Triplett, and he became my mentor that really made a different life for myself and my family. So Ohio State really, we started a revolution that's spreading all over the world. We're changing the way people farm and produce food all over the world. Sad part is that a lot of the world's doing a better job of switching to no-till than we do. Randall said we're supposed to talk about politics, and it's sort of an appropriate time. I mean, all of us, I'm sure, watch evening news, and you know, I made a statement a few years ago, and I wonder how it's working out. How many of us really realized that one political party would be blaming the other political party for the bad weather? That's got to be a winner. You can't really. You know, we're talking about increased carbon in the atmosphere. Well, I was really interested in the previous presentations because Dr. Lau at Ohio State is really the guru of soil sequestration, carbon sequestration for the whole world. And he's just taught us so much. But you know, he's also reminded us there's another dirty little secret about agriculture and about tillage. With tillage through the years, really since commercial agriculture got going, we've put as much carbon, maybe not as much. I hope they don't even measure it, but we've been putting a lot of that carbon into the atmosphere that our energy companies are getting blamed for. So these folks are right on track. It would be a dream if we could figure out how to really pay us farmers. At USDA, we only dreamed about being able to take a soil test and make our programs like the CSP reward those who are really doing a good job. We spend most of our time rewarding the people that are not doing a good job, but I better stay out of that politics for a while. 45 minutes, and these other guys are getting nervous already. But it's on the news every night. I mean, the Green New Deal, we're all scheduled for doom in 12 years. Those people on the coast, some of them might not worry whether the water comes up on some of the coast. The public wants to get involved in conservation and the environment, but gosh, they just don't know how. And I think that we better figure out how to help them, because they're not going to give up. Now in Ohio, we can see what the problem is. We can see the lakes and we can see the rivers, and that we're going to hear from our Director of Agriculture after this. But Governor DeWine has re-announced his H2O program for agriculture. Do you have the 10 things up on the wall yet? Okay, they're there. Okay, that's the 10 things that they come up with. The 10 things that they're going to really channel a whole bunch of money towards those. And do you all see anything wrong with that 10? Because there's a lot of things in there that I really agree with. I mean, anybody who suggests if you're going to have a program, you first better start measuring the soil. So soil testing is first. I happen to think that no-till is missing from that list. It's such a terrible error that one of those folks that really was on that committee, I sort of insulted him a little earlier today. I said, how did you let that happen? Why wasn't no-till on that list? Because after all, we know that no-till will give quick results that they can measure, and really is the first thing that we ought to be doing, or we ought to be encouraged to do. So the director's going to be next on the program. I'm sure that there'll be somebody in this room that will ask her why no-till is not on there. But let's don't shoot the messengers, because remember, she had this large committee of Farm Bureau, the conservation districts, all those people that really represent our industry. Let's make sure that the word gets out that no-till should be on that list. Along that line, Randall just handed something, and is that all on the table? Losing ground. I think he did a beautiful job of really analyzing. Well, read it. You'll know about it. Okay. What do we do to really approach? When those panels were talking this morning, I was just saying, what can we do? What can we do, or what will us farmers do? What will it take to get us farmers switched over to no-till? What will it take for other programs? I mean, USDA got the CSP program going. that was made to reward farmers for the good things that they were doing. But, somebody mentioned it earlier, we really run into problems with Congress because they said, well, why should we pay you farmers to do something that you should be doing anyway? So that's a hard sell to really get it done. Will voluntary approach work? Will farmers really react? Do we need voluntary with a little bit of a stick? Or are we going to wait and let the regulations hit us? And folks, if you listen to the public, if you watch television every night, you know that sooner or later that there's going to be real restrictions on the production of food. There's a way in between, and that was in the '85 Farm Bill, and it was called compliance. We all had to have farm plans. We all had to show that we were complying with the rules, and in order to get our other government payments, and now it's our crop insurance, we had to really be following and be within compliance. I was there when that program was put in place. We had a lot of problems all over the country. We had a lot of mad farmers, but it was working, and that's the approach that we ought to think about. Okay, that's really enough. I'm going to turn it over to my buddies here. Just remember, and I think it's been said over and over today, the public is going to expect responsibility from us farmers. We better be really trying to figure out how we're going to do it. With that, I rest the case.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks for letting me come out. I appreciate the invitation to come out and be with you all. As it was mentioned, I've been at Ohio State, a relatively new hire, 2 years. It was interesting, the previous speaker mentioned he was from Kansas and asked you all if you knew where Pretty Prairie, Kansas was. Well, I'm from Kansas and Missouri. I know exactly where Pretty Prairie is, and for the last 2 years I've been talking about how our water management issues are a lot different than Ohio. So when I moved out here, that was something I had to learn relatively quick. Was we were trying to keep as much water as we could, and you all are trying to give your water to somebody else. So I'm going to build a pipeline from Ohio to Kansas. We're going to create a trade system that way. So we'll see if that works. I want to give thanks to my panelists here. I mentioned I was relatively new. When I started out here, Alan Lyons, right next to me, his office is just down the hall from me. He welcomed me. He's been a great mentor for me here at Ohio State. But then when I was at K-State getting ready to come to Ohio State, one of my faculty advisors says, I've got a name I want you to remember and know well, and that name was Bill Richards. And I've gotten to work with Bill Richards a couple of times, and I really appreciate the advice and support he's given me as well. So with that, I was given a time limit. If you know me well, I talk a lot. Too much actually, so I either run out of time, go way over time, or I don't get everything said I want to say. So I've written my notes down, and I'm going to read them and stay on time and be respectful of your all's time and the time of my fellow panelists. But I want to start out and say that the conservation policy isn't necessarily my bread and butter. I work in agriculture markets and marketing, that's my specialty area, but I have a background in policy analysis, specifically farm policy. We have a good team of ag economists on staff in the Ag Econ Department at Ohio State that do research in environmental economics and resource economics, and that area is plenty, but agriculture economics and markets and farm management is weak, and so I spend my time in that working with the agriculture risk coverage, price loss coverage, dairy programs, marketing loans, and crop insurance. That's where my focus area is. But while I'm not as experienced in conservation policy as some of the others, I'm not naive to know, or I pay attention to what's happening in the conservation title, because I personally believe that what happens in the conservation title affects other areas of agriculture too. And so they should go hand in hand, in my opinion. But while I believe they should be considered together, the reality is that politically they are treated differently. They have separate budget lines in the Farm Bill, and the Congressional Ag Committees typically work on and finalize each of the titles of the Farm Bill separately and then move on. So therefore, my comments today are not necessarily based on research of conservation policy and to what it should be, which implies a value judgment debated by politicians, as Bill just mentioned a second ago, but more on the conditions under which it is implied, significant scientific observation, political appetite, and economic forecasts. In my opinion, the 2018 Farm Bill produced a rare setback for conservation policy in terms of funding, and we will see if that's a trend or not in future farm bills. The current suite of policies have roots to the Dust Bowl and were introduced in the landmark Food Security Act of 1985, as Bill just mentioned. Conservation policy is a critical component of the entire policy process, as agriculture is a minority party, with only 35 out of 435 congressional districts considered rural. And thus practicing as a minority party is critical. A main characteristic of a minority party is partnerships. Main partnerships in the Farm Bill process include the Agriculture and Food Power Cluster, the Food Safety and Nutrition Power Cluster, and the interest of this group here today is the Environmental Power Cluster. Partnerships contain policy to the middle, or in terms of a football analogy, the 40-yard lines. It doesn't stray much from that, because if you get two to one side, you lose your alliances with each other. However, while food programs make up 80% of the Farm Bill expenditures, there is evidence that their support is dwindling to the benefit of conservation. In a choice study done by myself and one of our students at Ohio State, we found that U.S. citizens, if given the opportunity to allocate Farm Bill dollars, would decrease nutrition spending by 42% in the Farm Bill, and conservation spending would be increased 214% of what is actually spent in the Farm Bill. Now, traditional farm programs will remain the same. People, before they knew what was in the Farm Bill and after, pretty much put the dollar amounts at the same thing. Now, percentages can be misleading because conservation receives $28.7 billion over 5 years. Nutrition receives $326 billion over 5 years. If we make our adjustments that I just talked about, that would give conservation $61.4 billion in conservation programs, and nutrition would still be $190 billion, or roughly 3 times the size. However, what this signals to researchers and hopefully to decision makers or legislatures is that citizens, when public money is being spent, would like to see more done for conservation. The H2O Ohio bill that Bill just mentioned is a possible reaction from this realization. However, we find that citizens are much less willing to spend their own money when they view it as their own, even if it's a cause that they support. So agriculture still has a problem. The problem is rooted in the cause that in the world where agriculture is a minority party, government benefit programs may be a political way of finding a solution. They are slow to materialize due to voluntary enrollment, as Bill mentioned. They have relatively loose compliance measures, as referenced in crop insurance eligibility, and eventually budget cuts. We then see that the program's enrollment falter when the money is then cut off. I like to think, and I think you all do too, that when a program gets established, that it will last even if government expenditures are taken back. But in more cases or not, the continuation of government assistance becomes a sustaining part of the use of a public target initiative such as conservation. There are numerous examples of this throughout the legislation as ad hoc disaster programs get transitioned to crop insurance programs, cost and share programs continue in the conservation tile, and income support get annualized into the commodity and crop insurance programs. However, this works as long as the public is willing to support the programs. This is viewed as potentially unsustainable because new initiatives always arise needing funding, and unless expenditures are increased, that means funding has to be taken from somewhere else to pay for the new parts. And then also, the agriculture industry should be allowed to react to market signals. We pride ourselves in the United States on capitalism, not socialism, but capitalism. However, programs that are viewed to be efficient and fair are ones where everyone is required to participate, not voluntary, and therefore treated equally. But this is often translated into the word taxes, and not politically appealing, usually because we have a long tradition in agriculture of private property rights. A short example is, and Randall mentioned this in his story, I'm going to do what I want to do on my land, you do what you do on your land, and we'll call it good, right? That's our tradition. Second example of policy that has little appeal but is more sustainable than our current form is any form of a certification program that is budget neutral and therefore it pays itself. This leads to price diversification at the grocery store, where people pay for a price of a trait they desire, such as organic, natural, or possibly in the future a label such as environmentally friendly. As I like to say, if people demand it, they should be willing to pay for it. But we know that as consumers and as purchasers at the grocery store, we're price responsive, meaning that we'll buy the cheapest product while still demanding the trait we desire. And then lastly, this is what's known as cheap food policy. So where we end up is a system based on voluntary programs where the public pays for a policy that they view as supporting something they value, even though it creates unintended causes somewhere else, costs more than what it's valued at, and relies on continued support from the public. That support is going to get tested in 2019, as estimates show 30% of farm income nationwide is going to come from government assistance. If you don't think people are paying attention, I encourage you to watch the news and read the paper. I'm happy to talk more about our farm policy as it's transitioning, but in short I will say that in the last 2 years we have transitioned from a market-based response system with a safety net to straight income support with no safety nets. This is different possibilities for future conservation programs. I'm going to be a typical economist and talk out of both sides of my mouth. As Harry Truman used to say, give me a one-handed economist instead of two, but here we go. On one hand, history would tell us that income support policies limit involvement in non-government conservation practices, so voluntary, just no government cost share support. If we continue down the income support path as we have the last 2 years, this will be a very real possibility. On the other hand, there are presidential candidates that want to go back to a supply control system similar to we had pre-1996 with land set-asides, government shocks, and marketing quotas. This path would be supportive to the broader conservation policies, but would mean a large decrease to the U.S. production ag sector and threatens the coalitions I mentioned earlier. In the absence of straight income supports, conservation policy is understood to be a balance of producing a crop with the impacts of natural resources and public goods like air and water. Soil has not been officially considered a public good, but there is evidence that we are trending in that direction. In the absence of regulation, where the agriculture industry in a broad characterization has opposed and applauded those legislators that roll back regulations, we end up with a very little environmental compliance for government assistance, even when the government supports it. Why? Because of the property rights mentioned above, and what we view policy to be one-dimensional, meaning that every policy has one task, not multiple. This also comes from the budget and legislative process mentioned earlier. In my opinion, a large overhaul on agriculture views of property rights is the first step in any major and substantive conservation policy that is efficient, involves the public, and is monetarily stable. This will only become more important as higher percentages of land transition to absentee landowners, and as rented land to producers and rental contracts become shorter and increasing in turnover. All of this said, voluntary programs with large public expenditures seem to be our policy path at the moment, and in the short term going forward, given the regulation is objected and identified as a form of taxes and infringement on property rights, and the U.S. citizens indicate purchases that they are unwilling at the moment to spend their own money on an attribute that they demand, but may in the future. Conservation policy is tricky in these regards because what we know to work politically is unappealing to the market and unappealing to legislatures, but could change in the future. Complicating this even further is agriculture's lengthy turnover in terms of our research. Iowa State University researchers are still trying to figure out if cover crops increase or decrease crop insurance payments. It'll take years before we figure out that answer, but policy reacts quickly, so we get things that don't necessarily match what we know to be true. However, the broad message is whether we like it or not, conservation policy is still made in the realm of what should be, which is political value judgment, not on economic forecasts or the implied externalities that are well defined. This creates challenges for voluntary programs, land rental agreements, and sustained public assistance supporting conservation programs. I thank you all for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay. That's a quick one. It's on. Everybody can hear this one if I hold it up here. I've got a couple things that are really bothering me. And that's why this man asked me to be on this panel along with these other two, esteemed gentlemen. One of the things that, way back when, as an undergraduate student, and I'm from New York. That's where my home is, New York State, Western New York. A much different kind of a world than the Midwest. And I had a great farm management professor at Cornell, Stanley Warren. And he began his farm management course. And midstream, and in graduate school, he kept reminding me, he said, Alan, do your economic research. But before you announce the results and try to get everybody to follow what you think they should be doing, go out in the state and find out if the best farmers in the state are doing what you think your research is saying. And if they're not doing what your research says, then there's something wrong with your research. And I still believe that. And I'm here today, and I think I'm with some of the best farmers in the state of Ohio. But what bothers me is why the rest of the farmers are not following suit. So I have a kind of a divergence here. Because the research, every place we look, the numbers come up the same. Do this, do this, do this, protect, protect, protect. But I don't see it happening. And I ask myself, who's wrong? And I can't ever get an answer. I go out to farmers and I ask them, not this past spring, but the spring before that, I had a meeting up in north central Ohio. And as I was coming back from that meeting, I kept watching the streams. I came back to back roads for a purpose, to see what farmers were doing. And I would cross these little bridges and these little streams, and it'd just be a mud stream going underneath some of these. And I knew enough farmers around, I would stop and ask, why aren't you doing something to control this? You've got a brown river running down behind you on your farm. And the answer I kept getting was this: it doesn't work and it costs money to do it. And I kept saying to myself, what's wrong here? Doesn't it really work? But the evidence says it will work. But it's that combination of really trying to make sure that we understand that it's being applied properly in terms of all these conservation areas. But I'm still struggling with why it's so difficult to get over the hump. And what really bothered me most was about 10 years ago, somewhat in that range, I was with a group of, again, some of the best farmers in the state of Ohio. We went up north to visit a farm. And we visited the farm, we looked at the equipment, the buildings and everything, really top notch. We went into the machinery shed to sit down and talk amongst ourselves and ask some questions of each other. And the farmers kept talking. And finally I raised my hand and I said, I want to say something to you. And I said, do you know that one of your esteemed professors at Ohio State University just made the recommendation to the state of Ohio to put a tax, an extreme tax, on every pound of fertilizer that's sold in the state? Any of you remember that?
Yeah.
Maybe you don't, but that was the case. You wasn't you wasn't here yet. But, and that was it. He did this big study about how do we get this water quality and erosion and everything under control. And the audience just went crazy. The farmers just climbed all over my back. I was the OSU representative there. And they just hollered and shouted and went on at me. What? One of your professors is saying to increase the price of fertilizer by 50%, by 100%, and farmers will then use their market analysis to say, I should put less fertilizer on my field. And finally, the noise got so loud, the owner of the farm stood up and he said, had his hand in the air and said, boys, quiet down. But they were just so set up. And he said, I want to tell you something. And he said this, about 2 years ago, I hired a water quality analysts to come to my farm and put sampling devices all over my farm where water was leaving the farm, leaving the field, leaving the farm, whatever. And he said, you know, this spring, that water quality analyst called me and said this: I would like to come out and show you the results of my 2 years of collecting data on your farm. And he said, yes, come on out. So the analyst comes out on Wednesday, they have an appointment to meet. He drives up in his car, he gets out, he greets the farmer, and the analyst says this: where can we talk? And he said, in my office. Fine. He said, okay, it's fine. So, but they get to the office, and then the analyst says to me, I want to make sure there are no microphones, the phones are shut off, the doors are locked, because this information is only for you and me. We got in the office, they sat down, he said, this is the information he gave to me, and the farmer is interpreting this now. He said to me, here's the results of our tests for 2 years. Don't let anybody get a hold of this information, or the state of Ohio is going to shut you down as a farm business. The water quality was that bad, from the fertilizers, the chemicals, the erosion, everything else. And this was on pretty fat land. And these farmers find it down. So then I had an opportunity, I met with those groups of farmers over the years since then. I said, now what did you do with that information about water quality that we learned from this farmer? Not a hand goes up. We didn't do anything. We didn't change anything. And I said, yes, you did change something. You've had the opportunity in a period of time where most of you, if you remember, back there in the 09 to 014 area, where you were earning what some people call sinful profits on your farm. Prices were high, yields were good. What did you do with the money, the extra money you had? Did you fix the problem on your farm with erosion and water quality? And they said, no, we didn't do anything. And I said, yes, you did. What'd you do with your money? Oh, we went and bought new equipment. We raised the price of farmland from $2,000 to $10,000, and you still had money left over. Why didn't you work on those problems that you knew were on your farm? And they simply said, it doesn't work. And it costs money. And we're really farming, making decisions so that we can live initially in that next year and maybe the following year that we're going to succeed. And they had done nothing. And I don't think that was quite, in my estimation, was quite the right thing to do. There was opportunity there. But I also want to remind you at this point that, in fact, when you're listening to me talk, I want to give you a perception of some of my students in class. Back in the 80s, Ernie Platinum, when he started, okay, I was starting back there in the 70s and the 80s. You weren't alive, okay? Yeah, I guess that'd be right. But you remember what happened to the price of farmland back there in the 80s. It was up here and zoom, down it went. Now, in the end of my farm management class, I'm talking to these folks, and I said, you boys, you young ladies, there were a couple of girls, these are students who are planning to go back home and farm. And I said, you need to rethink that right now. Maybe the good time, maybe the bad time. But this price of land that went from 1,000 on up to 2,000, I said, that's not going to continue. The price of that land is going to come down as this economic situation continues. And as a young man from Northwest Ohio, I know the family well. He was getting ready to graduate, go home and farm. And I could see him in the back seat, in his seat back. He keeps twisting around. He's getting nervous. Before I finished the lecture, he got up out of his seat in the back of the room. He just walks right up to the front of the class without saying a word. So I kind of stepped out of the way. And he proceeded to go to the blackboard, and he drew something on the blackboard. I have to remember the rest of it. He did this. And just to give you perspective on what other people think, he drew this thing on the board. He was a better artist than I was. He drew that on the board. And I'll get out of the way. Can you all see it? Mike, can you see it?
Barely.
I'm probably in the way. Anyway, I looked at that and I stumbled around trying to answer his question. He's standing up in front of me. He went back to his seat. He stood up. He said, Dr. Lyne, he said, what is that I just drew on the board? I looked at it. I said, gee, it just looks like a pair of glasses and a set of boots. And he said, no, just like you've misinterpreted what's going on in the farm economy, you've misinterpreted what that picture is. And he says to me, that's the farm management professor that we all know with the shit kicked out of him. I kid you not, no. Go to my grave with that one. But anyway, we got to hear that oftentimes we're asked to think about what's going to happen. We often do. And what I'm saying to you, what I've heard all here today is that there's something happening in our world that we live in. And I want to begin again by saying, how many of you've all heard, the TV story, the greatest generation. You remember that on the TV? How many of you would put yourselves in the middle of that greatest generation? Anybody? Sure, some of you would. I can tell by looking at you. Over here, everybody. But I want to say to you that you as a group here are part of a different greatest generation. How many of you were farming in 1975? Even before that, this thing working on and off. I don't know what, here it goes again. Do you remember what the national average corn production per acre in 1975 or 1980? You got a guess? So about 80 to 85 bushels per acre. And what are we looking like now? 165, 170 we're looking at over time. Doubling corn production per acre in this country. You and your counterparts have changed the world in terms of what you can do with this soil. But I want to add one other thing to you in a little different context. When we think about the impact of what you've done with this farmland during these last 30 or 40 years, you have made the world a different place to live. Allowed more people to leave the farm. Yes. And make the world a better place to live. Human diets around the world are better today than they were 30 years ago because of you folks sitting here and what you decided to do. But that growth has come at a cost. And as I look at this thing, it seems to me we have had farm policy that has encouraged, if you will, I'm going to use a word you don't like, our farm policy has encouraged you to abuse the soil that we all depend on. And I'm asking Ben, as the young member here now, farm policy needs to be changed to refocus the use of those public dollars to work on this question of preserving and conserving this land. When I hear over and over again, and people approached it here today, since we put that plow to work in the Midwest, we've lost half of our topsoil. We've lost half of our organic matter. That cannot continue. We've got to reverse that situation. And I really look at that and say, farm policy at the national level has helped create the situation that we are trying, and you are trying, and investigating, wreck this situation. And the answer to me is that voluntary programs are not going to work. That it's going to take some sort of an incentive. And the public is saying, we want something back from you. And the result of this is you need to change your definition of this is my farm, I can do what I want to do with it. And no longer can we afford that liberty. It has to change. So be very, very careful. If you and your colleagues don't correct this water, this air, this soil problems that are so apparent with American agriculture, the hammer is going to come down. And you better get it corrected before that hammer gets pretty big. That's really what I wanted to say to the audience. So thank you.
You said it. Yeah, let's have a round of applause for the panel. I know we're infringing on the break, but there's got to be a couple of questions. Great.
Well, Alan, what you're saying is what happened in Chesapeake Bay. The farmers in the Chesapeake Bay were destroying an estuary, and you had the legislatures decide what was going to happen, and then they provided the cost sharing and whatever else to make the change.
Exactly. And it went like this. And what I hear from our legislatures is, you have told us for the 10 or 15 years that we are working on this problem, but the problem's worse now than it was 15 years ago.
See, the Director of Agriculture just walked in, so that's great news. Okay. This is more of a question than a statement. For every ton of soybeans or corn that we export out of China, wherever it goes, how much soil are we losing for every ton? Are we losing a ton of topsoil with every ton of soybeans? Anybody know the answer?
You must know the answer.
No, I don't know. Where do you go? Okay, maybe we get that answer later. But anyway, it's an issue regardless of what it is. And right here we have the answer to that, because where it's been 5, 10, 20 tons an acre that we're losing every year with no-till and with cover crops and the great practices that we've heard about here today, instead of tons, that could be a few pounds per acre. If you don't believe that, there's research from Coshocton that verifies that.
It's not going in the road, it's going down the river or up in the air.